Okay. We're somewhere 75 logins as we speak. And we are 2 minutes after 3 hour time. Probably 1 more minute and we'll just hit the road and let other people come in. Already that's quite a number and we don't want to keep people waiting for too long. I think that's great. So about a minute before we hit the road. All right, I think we will get now started. So far, we've got 97 people, already 99, it's just going up like real fast. Great to see a lot of interest on this. We have every reason to believe that this is meant to add value to our ecosystem. And it is part and parcel of continuous learning and also developing new insights and skills of what do we need to do as a country, as a people, and as a society. So to get us started off, my name is Dr. Tony Muanza. I am the CEO of Kenya National Innovation Agency, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a little while. And I joined the Kenya National Innovation Agency a few months back, that's going 5 months now, as the first substantive CEO of this agency, which has been in formative stages for a few years now. So Kenya National Innovation Agency was set up to support the development and nurturing of the national innovation system. And when we say national innovation system, it's an array of things. You know, it starts from thinking through how we improve the quality of ideas, how we improve the research that translates to commercial value, how do we create incentives that then facilitate the growth of that research into societal solutions. What is the regulatory environment supposed to look like? What is the institutional infrastructure to facilitate growth of innovation? How do we get private sector, government, private sector collaborating to ensure that innovative solutions find their way into market? And that is why the vision of Kenya is actually around developing and nurturing this system that then facilitates ideas to market. We try to look into how various players in the ecosystem collaborate so that we can get greater value. We think about standards, we think about partnerships, we think about visibility, we think about networks, we think about events that then help to amplify this agenda. So when we start talking to intellectual property people or the Bureau of Standards or the Revenue Authority, then you can see why all these are important stakeholders in making sure that the Kenya achieves her mandate. So the mission, why we're here, is to try and develop and manage a dynamic national innovation system for Kenya that will facilitate taking of ideas to market. Now that's really ambitious, and then it really sounds great, because we would be measured by how many ideas really get to market. And when we say get to market, they will consume, somebody will pay for them, not only once, but again and again, and that they would relieve some pain point in the lives of this kind of people. So To do that, we are asked to try and develop and manage this dynamic. In other words, we are sensitive to the times that tomorrow the realities might be a little different from the way they are now. And that is Kenya. We're in the formative stages. So I joined the agency about five months ago, and we began to build a team that will then champion this agenda. The last few years, we've had a board and we've had an acting CEO and support staff that have laid the foundation that we needed. We've got 6 strategic priorities that we're focused on now for the next few years. The first one is to try and strengthen the policy and legal framework. And this is really trying to understand, how do we structure the incentives and the support system that enables then ideas to thrive, whether they're coming from research or they're coming from industry or they're coming from individuals. What should be the policies that then would support this kind of intention? The second area is around commercialization. So we're keen to try and figure out, how do we support the movement of ideas and research into commercial value? That's really commercialization. And in this case, we think a lot about universities, research centers, TVETs, even high schools, research institutions. We're thinking about even private sector, where some form of research kind of tends to happen that could move into commercial value. The other one is around funding. Now, we recognize that for you to build a strong technology transfer program, it's going to cost some money. You're going to need some skills in there, and these skills will have to be compensated. If you have to harvest the innovative solutions, you will have to look for them, and that has a cost implication. So funding is the second element that we have to think about, both internally and in terms of how we support the institutions and individuals. We would like to find ways of funding early stage ideas that need to be tested and validated. We're looking for ways, how do we strengthen funding for ideas that have actually been validated and need to grow and scale. And some of that funding may come from Kenya, but part of that funding will come from other people who are interested in supporting these ideas to scale. It could be VCs, angel investment of sort, whatever arrangement that may take, it is something that we are looking to strengthen a lot. So one of the programs we are designing right now is what we're conceptualizing an innovation fund, which then will help us think end to end about how we fund innovation in the country. The fourth strategic area is around dissemination and awareness. So by organizing a forum like this, it's about trying to create awareness, trying to increase visibility of what we're trying to do and how it can help individuals and society. So we will be very deliberate that index. We need to find a way to measure our performance at county level, and how do we contribute to the national innovation index from counties, and even how do we fit into the global innovation index. So we've got a bunch of ideas of things we are trying to work on, and we're looking for partners to strengthen this narrative of disseminating and increasing awareness. Awareness could even be around intellectual property and its management and its exploitation. It could be in the business modeling for ideas that are coming out of research. It could be about business models for universities to diversify on their revenue generation, over and above the funding that comes from government as well as from students, and so on and so forth. Then we've got another strategic pillar, which is capacity development. And we look at it in 2 fronts. One is to try and build the capacity of the agency to be able to meet the mandate. That means have the right skills and number of people to support the organization. And then the second dimension is thinking about skills across the country. And that starts from the lowest level of education, trying to move more and more into 21st century skills, competence-based curriculums, problem-based learning, design thinking, user-centered design in our education system. And now not only are we saying from the lowest level, but it's always all the way to the leadership level. We've got heads of parastatals, heads of government, head of private sectors, managers, and so on and so forth. And the more we diffuse innovation leadership, innovation mindset in them, then we measure that as success. So capacity development is going to be a strong strategic pillar for us. And finally is around partnerships and linkages. So This is across board. We're looking at private sector, development partners, multinationals, county governments, working with innovation hubs, and so on and so forth. Partnership and linkages, and that's going to be across the globe. We're going to be very, very aggressive in building partnerships across. So I've introduced you Kenya, and now I'll introduce you to the webinar series. So one of the things we've thought within that dissemination and awareness perspective is we are organizing a series of webinars. This is the inaugural webinar, and we're going to build a number of them on different topical issues. Could be around policy. Think about fourth industrial revolution. Think about design thinking. You know, we can talk about leadership of innovation and so on and so forth. So in this inaugural webinar, we're focused on commercialization. We begin to think about what is this thing, commercialization? How do we get it to work? Who is succeeding and why? What are the critical success factors? And how do you ensure that you can get as much value out of it as possible? And the way we've designed this webinar series, we've got a key guest here who has many years of experience in the US. He is a Kenyan, for those who don't know. Kenneth Karanja. He introduced himself substantially at that point. But the point is we've structured it such that we will have 30-minute sessions where he presents, and then we take breaks and ask questions, and then he comes back for another session until we are done. So we've got 2 sessions basically, and 2 breaks in between there. You're welcome to post questions in the chat, and during that break, we can go ahead and engage on those questions. We will also have a few live polls. So we might ask specific questions, and you either have to tick something, and then we can get a sense of how the population thinks about some of these issues. And I really hope that this will be useful, because as Kenya, we're trying to set up a framework that will enable us to set up at least 5 commercialization programs in universities and research centers per year. We may call them technology transfer programs that enable institutions to really scale out some of the innovations that are coming from our institutions. So with that background, I would like now to introduce Dr. Kenneth Karanja from University of Minnesota. We are active on social media, and I know he's also active on social media. So we've got a team. You can tweet, and we've got a hashtag Kenya webinar series, and the Twitter handle for Kenya is Kenya Updates, and the hashtags we are using, of course, is Kenya webinar seminars. We also use once in a while enabling innovation. So over to you, Ken Karanja, and good luck.
Thank you, Dr. Muanza, for that introduction. And maybe just a little more about myself. I'm actually a graduate, or I started my university education at Egerton University before moving on to the US to finish my postgraduate studies and PhD. So I'm thoroughly inculcated in the Kenyan education system. So I know 1 or 2 things about that. Currently, my occupation is licensing, technology licensing at the University of Minnesota. And my training is biochemistry and molecular biology. I did almost a decade of bench research before transitioning into what we call dry science, technology transfer, building innovation capacity, and spinning out startups based on university technologies. So let me work the magic of today's IT and share my screen here. All right. Now. We have to learn how to work these things. It's sorry. All right. So as I mentioned, I'm a licensing officer at the university. I hope you can see my screen here, which is commercialization of university innovations. And I'm a licensing officer at this esteemed institution, University of Minnesota. We usually in our field of profession, we interact a lot with issues of law. So I have to issue a disclaimer and say that I am not representing the University of Minnesota. And what I'm about to tell you are my opinions, and do not consider them legal advice. It's a disclaimer that technology transfer professionals have to post because of the nature of our work. So having said that, I want to go through a number of terms that we will use during our webinar today. And these are germane to technology commercialization, as you will see in the ongoing slides. So to begin with, what is an invention? An invention is a creation of something new and useful. And most academic research creates a lot of innovations. You can call these discoveries as well. So innovation and discoveries, I will use that term synonymously. At the same time, universities do produce innovation. So an innovation is an invention that has commercial value. Mostly when we do research, we do basic research, we try to understand the laws of nature, and our intent is not to make a product. However, in the process of inventing, we do come up with innovations, and those are items or are inventions that we can place in the marketplace in return for revenue. The act of transitioning these innovations from a university setting to the private sector is called commercialization. And universities per se do not commercialize because that is within the realm of private industry. They have the resources and capability to scale up the production of innovations and place those in the marketplace for the consumption of society. So bearing that in mind, we have a two-part webinar series today, the first of several webinar series. And the first part, we will talk about the rationale for doing commercialization and why it is important to consider this as an aspect of your innovation economy and innovation ecosystem. We will then delve into some case studies using the University of Minnesota as an example. And then we'll take a break for some questions. And then part two will be a legal and policy framework outline that I will provide to you that allows us to engage in successful commercialization of research that comes from the university. And this is a model that is replicated among generally all universities or most universities that have commercialization offices in the United States. So we began 2020 with the hope that it would be a mundane year, nothing spectacular happening, but trouble was brewing from Southeast Asia. And within a couple of months, the world was inundated by what became the COVID-19 global pandemic. The coronavirus has affected everybody in the globe at almost the same time, with severe cases of disease happening in all the continents. And unfortunately, this has led to over 120 million infections and counting. And over 2 million people have lost their lives, unfortunately. However, the role of technology commercialization will become apparent because our ability to address this pandemic does depend on our capacity to transition innovations from the bench, clinical research, into the clinic and into the arms of patients. As I just mentioned, currently there are a number of vaccines that are being deployed all over the world to address the COVID-19 pandemic. AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna are but a few of the companies that have been successful in moving their clinical research from their internal R&D kept labs into the marketplace through a vaccine. I will highlight the work that's done by Pfizer and BioNTech as well as Moderna, because these two companies have leveraged what was initially an invention that became an innovation that we are now able to generate vaccines within a very short period of time. These two companies, as I mentioned, have leveraged what is called mRNA technology. And this technology was first invented, and you will notice that the definitions change. It was first invented at the University of Wisconsin, where researchers were able to isolate messenger RNA, that's a small molecule of ribonucleic acid, and injected this into mice, and they were able to produce a viable protein in the muscle of mice. At that time in 1990, there was speculation that this would be an innovation and maybe someone would pay for it, but that was not immediately apparent, and it required over 30 years of additional research and development and optimization of the technology and clinical trials to see that it is effective first in animals, then in humans, and eventually 30 years later, Moderna was able to leverage that technology to produce a vaccine within a really short period of time. The same approach was done by Pfizer and their partner BioNTech. The key here is to understand that technology and technology commercialization is really a long-term investment. It took 30 years of work to bring what was an invention in 1990 to become an innovation targeting particular issues in human health, and eventually commercializing these as a vaccine that we can now deploy and hopefully save the lives of hundreds of millions of humans in this particular case. So transitioning more local, so from the global to the local, or rather national in the United States, we will discuss the role and rationale of university innovation and the commercialization of resulting research here in the United States. So the academic-centered innovation that will form the basis of my webinar is really driven by a number of key players, each with their own unique capabilities. The government, the three arms of governments are really instrumental in setting up all academic institutions from the local to the state to the federal. And in particular, in terms of innovations and commercialization, the federal government provides most of the resources along the innovation pipeline. So the funds that come to the university from governmental allocations are used to fund research in all fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So the university will produce graduate students who are critical elements of this ecosystem, because those will get employed in industry and contribute to the productization of ideas, wherever those ideas may come from, because industry is agnostic as to where they source their ideas. At the same time, in addition to graduates, universities do produce basic information, basic knowledge about how we live in science, and key to what we do are those innovations that have commercial potential, and these we transition to industry as well, because industry has the capacity, both financial and people capital, to be able to produce a product or a service based on that particular innovation that has come from the university. The industry as well has issues that they see. There are certain pain points that they appreciate from what they do every day, and they often come back to the university and request that the university solve a particular pressing need in that given industry. And so the cycle of research continues in that regard. The university solves the problem, hands over the innovation through technology transfer, and the industry then implements that solution. Nonprofit organizations are also critical to what we do, because universities are generally founded to produce knowledge and not products. And non-profit organizations, including foundations, help us stay grounded in that primary mission, and at the same time, transitioning some of what we produce at the university into the private sector to help our lives, as that coronavirus vaccine clearly illustrated. You can think of nonprofit organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that addresses certain critical diseases that industry would not work with those diseases because they don't have a large enough market. For the nonprofits, we look at what we call orphan diseases, diseases with small markets, and they work with universities to find solutions for those diseases, and then help deploy those technologies back to industry that has the commercial wherewithal to develop a solution. Finally, capital, both people and purse. So the people capital, of course, is the main thing. If it wasn't people, we would not be here, right? So capital comes in form of people and money and funds. And in terms of venture capital is critical in helping the startups that we spin out of universities get on their feet, grow, and make a product of the innovations that they obtain from us. Venture capital, of course, also drives other aspects of industry, and we will see that as we go on in our webinar. So these players are critical in ensuring that we have a robust innovation ecosystem that generates goods and services that address everyday human needs. Now looking at the national level, and here we are looking at the contribution just specific to university innovations and the tech transfer process, how that facilitates the growth and sustenance of the economy here in the US. From our organization, the Association of University Transfer Managers, Technology Transfer Managers, and we'll get several slides from this association, we can see that the broad US economy is quite impacted by innovations from universities. For example, about $1.7 trillion of US industry output is linked to innovations that are coming from the over 3,000 universities in the US. The US GDP also is impacted by these innovations to the tune of $865 billion. Of particular interest to us, of course, is the capacity to generate employment. And a lot of these innovations, once they're out in the marketplace being developed into goods and services, they provide employment for almost 6 million people. So this is a significant impact, and close and dear to my heart as a biomedical scientist is the fact that we have over 200 drugs and vaccines based on what we call wet science, the everyday science that goes on the scientific bench. And those discoveries or inventions that are also innovations that target particular diseases, we can commercialize those, and then we have an array of medicines and medicaments and vaccines that can help our everyday health. Most of the technologies that we generate are actually licensed to startups and small companies. SMEs play a critical role in this process because they are able to take more risk and develop that into a product or a service. And over time, we facilitate these over 14,000 startups that, of course, contribute to the employment that I mentioned. And we have over 500,000 inventions disclosed since 1996, and over 100,000 issued patents. Now let's look at just all universities in the US, and this is data from 2019. As I mentioned, we generate research product based on funding from the federal government and state agencies, as well as nonprofits and businesses as well. And research expenditure in 2019 was about $77 billion worth of research expenses, which then generated over 25,000 invention disclosures. So these are raw inventions. And then we have to dig through those inventions and look for innovations that address a particular need. That led to over 15,000 US patents filed and 7,500 US patents issued. And of course, we have patents all over the world, but this is just a US patent. We license over 9,000 licenses, and these licenses hopefully will generate revenue over time, which then feeds back to the research enterprise. And 711 products were made in 2019, and over 1,000 startups as well. Even closer to home, the University of Minnesota, this is data from 2020, was a key cog in this innovation wheel and innovation ecosystem. And we took in about $1 billion in research expenses, running from basic research, applied research, as well as product research. And we generated almost 400 inventions, which we then assessed and protected 152 of those using US patent applications. We licensed almost over 200 licenses, and these are income generating licenses. We bring in a revenue back to the university that then feeds back to the research enterprise, as well as incentivize the researchers and inventors of these technologies. And we spun out 19 startups in 2020. So the idea is that universities usually spin out high technology, but that's not the case. But there's an argument to be made if I say that an apple is not high technology. As a plant scientist, I will argue vehemently that it is high technology. But nonetheless, our technology is run from plant varieties, apples, fruits, ornamental grasses, to sophisticated implantable cardiac devices, such as the one depicted here. We have the flight data recorder that was invented at the University of Minnesota, and medicaments and medication for both humans and animals, pig vaccines, and Zyrogen, which was one of the first antiretroviral medications to address the AIDS crisis. Looking at the University of Minnesota, and I'm about to introduce our Office of Technology Commercialization, we at the Twin Cities campus are the hub of the technology transfer program at the University of Minnesota. So the University of Minnesota is a 5-campus system, and all the other universities, Duluth campus, Crofton campus, Morris, and Rochester, they feed their invention disclosures to the Twin Cities campus. So we are the hub of the system. And then we work with those universities to commercialize those particular innovations that come from those universities. There's another layer of universities, but we don't work with those. They're state universities. These are the main flagship institutions that we work with. At the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, the hub, our Office of Technology Commercialization is structured like a business, because we want to have that mentality that we are a business working within a university. And this office has about 5 business units. I'm going to highlight 2 business units here that are germane to our discussion. We will introduce one for startups later on. And the 2 groups are the technology strategy group. So this is the group that works with faculty members, staff, and students. They are the inwards facing unit that goes to source for inventions and takes in those invention disclosures from the various labs in the university. So this group evaluates, once a disclosure is sent into the office, they evaluate that invention. It's an invention at that time, it's a new creation of the mind. And we determine those inventions that are actually innovations, inventions with commercial value or commercial potential at this point. Once we make that assessment, we will protect that innovation using patents. So patent law comes into play, and we determine what kind of patent protection that particular innovation requires. Once we understand what it is, this group, the technology strategy group, will hand off that asset at that point to the technology licensing group, of which I am a member. And this group looks for a product market fit by aligning that asset with a given industry partner. The industry partner is vetted to make sure that they have the capacity to develop this asset into a product. And then we transfer that asset to the entity using a licensing agreement. We often license to companies that are already established and have the people and capital to move this technology forward. as well as to startups, often the startups that we launch from the university ourselves. So our main clients are outward-facing industry partners. At this point, I want to highlight that the office itself does not commercialize the innovation from the university. We don't make a product. Rather, we take that asset and transfer it to an industry partner to make the product. However, that process, which is called technology transfer, the transfer of technology, is also an aspect of commercialization, because we are commercializing, deriving value from a given asset that was generated in a given lab at any of the 5 campuses. So once that asset goes to the private sector, they can now build up on it, do value addition, innovate around it, scale up, and do what needs to be done to deploy that into the marketplace. So having said that, the cycle of innovation is critical to what we do, because the research done at the university is disclosed to us. We evaluate that and we protect it given the right intellectual property process. Once we hand it over to companies and they deploy it into the public space, citizens who are also consumers, they will pay tax, which then feeds back to the research enterprise. They get a product that solves an immediate need, and this innovation cycle continues. So in the next couple of slides, we will look at practical case studies based on things we do here at the University of Minnesota in terms of technology commercialization. In the 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, we all remember that there was a similar epidemic going through the world at the time, which was the AIDS crisis. And there was a significant increase in the number of infections and number of deaths from people infected by the HIV, which then becomes AIDS. This particular crisis generated a lot of interest, and the federal government, through the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, it's a government agency, so it has to have a mouthful of a title, but nonetheless, they were very interested in finding out solutions to this crisis, and they funded research. And one of our faculty members applied for a grant, and they got money to study how to address this particular crisis. So Dr. Robert Vince was one of these faculty members. He applied for a grant and was lucky to get it and bring the money to the university to do research in HIV. He is a chemist and a pharmacist by training, so he was looking at molecules that can be used to address this disease. He synthesized a molecule called abacavir, and this molecule has antiviral property. It inhibits the replication of HIV. Once he studies the molecule, got a pharmaceutical relevant lead compound, we filed for a patent, and we got an issued patent in 1990. Based on our process of commercializing our innovations, we licensed these to GlaxoSmithKline, and they deployed their resources to scale up, formulate, optimize this compound, and they launched a drug called Xiagen, that's shown here. And that was after the Food and Drug Administration did their regulatory assessment and approved it as a drug suitable for human use. And this was deployed in the market, and millions of lives were saved. AIDS patients could access this antiretroviral drug, which was one of the first to hit the market. And of course, GlaxoSmithKline made a fortune from commercializing this compound that we had licensed to them. And at the tail end of that, they shared their revenue with the university to the tune of $600 million over the 20-year life of the patent. And this revenue was shared with the inventors, of course, to appreciate their efforts in working on this particular project and to incentivize them to develop more innovations. And part of the money, again, went back to funding the research enterprise as well. So this first case study is a faculty member. Although we are successful in licensing, the journey is not linear. And in fact, most, if not all, technologies have to pass through this valley of death. And this is the point at which, unfortunately, a great number of innovations do not see the light of day. This happens because the university is set up to produce basic research. They are not looking for a particular solution. But if that invention has commercial potential, it still has to be de-risked from the university end to take it to corporations who have the wherewithal to develop it into a product. And because the focus of universities is basic research and the focus of corporations really is productization and commercialization, that gap is what we call the valley of death. The University of Minnesota and other universities, having realized this, we provide specific funds to transition an innovation from the left, the basic innovation, to transition it to a point where corporations can license it and develop it. The CTSI, the Center for Translational Medicine at the university, is funded both by the National Institute of Health as well as grant money from the university. And we provide two primary grants. The translational grant, which is a smaller grant, about $50,000. Faculty members and staff and students can apply for that grant. It provides them some funds to do a proof of concept study, build a benchtop prototype, and de-risk the technology by moving it further along the development pathway from more basic to applied, where you're solving a particular problem. The second grant is a translational product development fund or grant. And this is a larger grant of about $400,000. And this grant goes to more substantive studies. You can imagine in the clinical field, you might want to do large animal studies, which are quite expensive. So this larger grant goes towards moving research into such preclinical studies using large mammals, and also de-risk. In this case, we're trying to see if the molecule is safe. And that de-risking also adds value to that technology. And that asset can now be packaged by our office and presented to companies and corporates that would want to license it and move it into their internal R&D programs. And then hopefully over time, they will generate a product that will feed back into the system. For the second case study, we take now a different tack. We look at agriculture, and we know that agriculture is the mainstay of many economies. And in fact, the Midwest of the United States is the breadbasket of the country. However, our ability to feed ourselves depends on how well we can produce various crops, and crop production requires the use of synthetic fertilizers and manure. However, overfertilization can be an issue due to nutrient and sediment runoff, which when it goes to rivers and water bodies, it becomes a critical environmental issue. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and the US Department of Agriculture are concerned in addressing these issues, and they deploy funds, which our faculty members again can apply for a grant to look at a particular solution. So in this case, a faculty member and 2 graduate students got a grant from the state of Minnesota to look at fertilizer management, and they deployed or developed at the time an agronomy software that a farmer can download, and using geographic information system technology, they can use that software to determine how much fertilizer a given field needs. The 2 graduate students formed a company called Insight Sensing. And this company is trying to develop a product that then farmers can download on their phones and use it in the field to determine how much fertilizer is required for a given crop. So this company is looking forward to launch a product in the agricultural informatics space that will optimize fertilizer application in the field. minimizing the cost of inputs, maximizing productivity and profitability, as well as addressing environmental issues associated with overfertilization. So that second case study is graduate students with the startup. The third case study involves another health implication. The West has a large and aging population, and aging brings with it significant health challenges, one of which is osteoarthritis. And osteoarthritis is on the increase, especially among women. The National Institute of Health also has grants to address some of these challenges, and one faculty member and his staff scientist applied for a grant to study this and find solutions for osteoarthritis. So the staff scientist, who's a lady, perhaps understanding what comes with age, so the diversity of thought is critical to the innovation ecosystem. She was studying stem cell technology and researching how you can use stem cell to regenerate tissue. And they successfully came up with a method and process of creating cartilage from stem cells. And these stem cells, using animal models, can be injected to replace the cartilage that is worn out in the knee. The staff scientist has formed a company which is now actively developing a solution using stem cell technology that can be used to treat osteoarthritis. And she has funding from both the state of Minnesota and from the federal government to move this technology forward. So once successful, the technology will disrupt the market, because current mode of treating osteoarthritis is a double knee implant, which can be really invasive and expensive. But if the solution they are working on is successful, they can inject stem cells in the knee, and that will be quite disruptive to the market because it's now a minimally invasive solution. For every company that we successfully launch, there is significant nurturing and support that is needed. And the University of Minnesota is active in this space in ensuring that we start viable startup companies. So during our evaluation process in the Office of Technology Commercialization, we license to startups only those technologies that are platform technologies that can be a firm foundation for a startup. Our startups are started by faculty, staff, or students, as a particular case may be. Now I will introduce our third business unit, part of our office, which is the Venture Center. The Venture Center has programs from the Venture Center Launchpad, and this is a specific program where we give advice to the startup. We provide business advice for how to write business plans, how to do voice of customer, how to develop proof of concept, and how to navigate the regulatory environment if you want to launch a regulated product. At the same time, we have an internal funding mechanism, the Discovery Capital. This capital is actually funded by some of the revenue that we get from the licenses and company exits. And that money is then used to fund some of our startups. Our startups will pitch to Discovery Capital, and if they qualify, we invest in them. However, this program is managed by people external to us because of conflict of interest issues, because these are our own startups. So we have an external advisory committee that will evaluate those technologies and make an independent decision, and then suggest to us which companies to invest in. And we work with the General Counsel's office and the investment officer at the university to invest in those startups. And it is a matching fund. So the startup will come with several $1,000, and we will match those funds from the Discovery Capital. It is a popular program, but it is very competitive, very stringent. We vet companies that are most likely going to succeed in the marketplace. At the same time, we give support from the broader university programs and processes. So the Carlson School of Business has what we would call a Faculty Innovators Workshop. That is a workshop funded by the National Science Foundation to give training and education to founders. And those founders will come and founding some of these startups, as well as the general public that is interested in innovation and entrepreneurship. Once they go through that process, they have at least the basic foundation to start and grow a company. At the same time, we have a business advisory group. This is a group of experts from the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, that have an interest in what we do. Perhaps they were former students, former employees, business executives from the medtech space, and they form this group that can then give our startups advice, and sometimes our startups get their business executives from that group as well. The government also plays a key role, whereby the state government has funds that are accessible to our startups. The Launch Minnesota funds are another granting mechanism to our startups. So this is a non-dilutive capital that is available to the startup, so the startup doesn't have to give up any equity, but they will have access to funds that they can use to pay for part of their expenses. For example, the licensing agreement that we license our technology to the startup, there is an upfront fee that is involved, and they can use that money to pay for some of those initial expenses associated with setting up a company. The federal government, through the Small Business Administration, also provides some non-dilutive capital. Again, this is competitive, and the companies apply for the grant, and if successful, they get some funds that are beneficial for them as they start off and grow into a going concern. In the private sector side, you have private equity, and mostly in the form of seed funds that goes into the very inchoate companies. It's high risk capital, but companies have to pitch to these funds to be able to access that capital. As a company grows, it has access to venture capital. These are more larger venture funds with larger amounts of money that a company can pitch to, and we help these companies. So the Venture Center Launchpad helps the startup refine a pitch that can then be used to go to the VC firms to look for funds to grow the company. We also have some strategic partnerships where a large corporate wants to address a specific problem and partners with our startup to help that startup get the funds and capacity to scale up. That's also one way that our startups get funds and grow into going concerns that eventually exit and feedback revenue to the university. Over the years, using that model of venture center support, we have founded about 165 companies from 2006. And we've brought in over $400 million in research, in investment capital to our various startups, such as those depicted here. And since 2017, we have exited about 8 companies, giving us up to 7-figure paybacks. And of course, that money goes back into the research enterprise, as well as incentivize further innovation from the inventors and founders of these startups. The university itself also does take an equity stake in the startups. So once these startups exit, and depending on the level of dilution, we do get some good revenue back from those investments. So to just summarize this part of the webinar, you want to remember that universities are really founded to be primary generators of knowledge. They focus on generating new knowledge, understanding the basic mechanisms of science, and this is exemplified by the publications that we generate. And at the same time, we are teaching and training the next generation of employees and citizens, and we graduate a substantial number of students. For example, the University of Minnesota student population is almost 50,000 students. So we are quite active in that space, which is our original mission. At the same time, we do have a lot of innovations that we protect through patents. And these patents, where appropriate, we commercialize them, and any revenue that we get feeds back into our primary mission of basic research and training students and citizens. So we'll take a pause here. This is part one, and we'll take a couple minutes of your questions.
Thanks very much, Dr. Karanja. I think you've done quite some justice to introduce this space. And I see lots and lots of comments of people saying, you know, this is a great program. It's a great way to demystify some of these things and empower people to explore what they can do in their own spaces. You know, we hope that through Kenya National Innovation Agency, we're going to create a movement in a manner that universities can produce a diagram like the one you produced, the circular one, on an annual basis. And we are able to say, you know, this is how much revenue has been generated to the university. This is how many jobs that are created out of research that is commercialized from our universities. You know, this is the return on investment to the, you know, the taxpayer. And also this is how competitive, you know, this kind of work has made the country to be. Now, there are a few questions, and I'm going to ask you to consider them as you drink a glass of water.
Right.
While you do that, I noticed one person observed that your volume kept on going on up and down. It kind of fluctuated. Right. I think maybe it's coming. So you'll keep that in mind just as you go to the next session. Sure. So the questions I have, one of them is, how do you safeguard the interest of the inventor over the long term, and in bracket 100 years plus? That is interesting. Number one. Number two, does the university benefit from licensing of the innovations, and to what level? So I think this is around what is the value for the university once you commercialize. Right. And then the third one is, how long was it from the grant to the commercialization of, I think there was this particular product that you mentioned, Abacavir?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a question about time from the grant to the commercial value of that product. So those are three questions. Maybe you can respond to those three, then I'll throw the three, and then, you know, we can explore what the next stage looks like.
Right. So the first question is about safeguarding the inventor. So that is based on university policy, which is going to be part of the second part of the webinar. So the university, once a patent is assigned to the inventor for the life of the patent, 20 years, and the university recognizes that, and if the technology is commercialized, we keep track of where that inventor went. If they leave the university and go to another university, then we request that they keep us updated on their contact address so we can mail them a check. And that feeds back to the second question, value to the university. That's also policy-based. The University of Minnesota gives a third of that revenue to the inventor for as long as that invention is commercialized, regardless of where they're at in life. A third of it, and we will see this again in the policy work, a third goes to the department and the college, and a third goes to the General Research Fund through the Vice President for Research. So that's how we share revenue with the inventors. So by law, because the patent law says the inventor is on the patent, their name will be there, and of course we policy-wise agree to share that revenue with the particular inventor. The third question, from the grant to commercialization, it is not linear. So one grant, because of the way the university does research, so a faculty member gets a grant, they may have other grants from other agencies. So long as they're generating knowledge, that's how we get an innovation. So it's not a linear pathway, but what we generally see is after the innovation comes to our office, I would say anywhere between 5 years to 10 years to get a commercial product because a software technology turnaround time is faster than a therapeutic. A therapeutic, you're looking at 10 years plus. Software, 3-5 years, you have a product in the market. But up until from grant to product, it's hard to tell because a professor could be working for 10 years in the field, and the 9th year is when they get a software that really can be commercialized. I hope that answers the question, yeah.
Yes, it does. Maybe I'll just add a little more weight to the issue around university-centered policy or university-focused policies. So what we would like to do as Kenya, being a young agency and trying to support this narrative of innovation, one is to support universities to either establish or strengthen their intellectual property management policies, be they incubation policies or commercialization policy, or whatever term that may be used. And in the process of doing that, we get universities to kind of make certain commitments around this shared revenue and the protection, and how to make sure the interest of the individual is taken care of. Structure, in terms of the policies in institutions. Of course, there are some which already have. The question is, how do we push that more and more into commercial value that is visible? There are then 3 more questions I'll take. I can see more, but we're probably going to take 3 more, and then we move to the next stage.
Yes.
The 4th one is saying, should universities be encouraged? Should universities be encouraging faculty to establish startups and be intimately involved in commercialization process? And then I think the extension here is, or should the national, I think it might be maybe the innovation center now with academics. In other words, should the system be get the university faculty to get involved in startups and get the right incentives behind that? Or should we more go the direction of encourage entrepreneurs to partners with academics to grow innovations? That's question 1. Question 2, much of the success of the US tech transfer can be attributed to the Bayh-Dole and existence of a vibrant industry, that is private sector, but these 2 are absent in Kenya. And I think the question is around what system-specific adjustments would you recommend or advise? And then the 3rd, what is the ownership ratio between the grant provider and the university and the inventor? Let's pick those, then we can probably move to the next section, and then we'll come back again to the questions.
Yes. So the first question, should university encourage faculty to start companies? And we do encourage our faculty members to start companies, but what we do is we are very stringent in the startups that we launch and support. So just because we have an entrepreneurial faculty does not mean we will have a startup from that faculty member. What we do is we vet the idea, because for a startup to be successful, it has to license a platform technology. If the technology we get is suitable for only one product, we encourage the faculty member to license that, and more often than not, they will take our recommendation, so that goes to a license. However, to an established company, in the case where you have a platform technology and the investigator is a leader in their field, then we consider a startup based on that, because then you have a platform, a technology with multiple applications with a high potential for success. And so yes, we do encourage, but we also vet and only fund and move with those ideas that have capacity to be successful. The second question about Bayh-Dole and private industry, that is true. The Bayh-Dole allows the universities to benefit from the research that is funded by the federal government. But in the Kenyan context, that our industry is not that big and perhaps we don't have a buy-it-all equivalent, I think the answer to that is to start. It's a long-term, as I showed in the beginning example, it's a long-term investment. So start somewhere to encourage that entrepreneurial spirit. You can partner with a few corporates that are accessible, and you can work with the corporates to solve, for example, some of their pain points, and then use that as a way of growing a system similar to what the US has. The US started doing this, as we will see in the second part, over 200 years ago. So it's a long-term process, but we have to begin somewhere to get our process going and to also change the mindset about innovation and the role of universities in the same innovation ecosystem. In terms of grant shares, so that's a good point. So the federal government is very liberal in how they are, based on buy-it-all, we can commercialize the technologies and innovations we get from those funds. For the private and non-profit funding mechanisms, those we have separate agreements. Some foundations will come and say, if, for example, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, they will say, once we fund research at the university, they give us the right to commercialize it. Once we commercialize, we share that revenue with them at a negotiated rate. The internal sharing mechanisms are unique to every university, and we will see in the case of Minnesota is 1/3 inventor, 1/3 this department, 1/3 Office of the Vice President for Research. And before we do that third sharing, we take 15% administrative costs for our office. But every university has a policy on how they share that revenue. And I think with that, we can move to the second part, and after that, we'll also take additional questions. So the second part, we will discuss some of the points that have been raised. These are the legal and policy framework that make technology commercialization successful. We begin with just the constitutional provision that allows the setup of the intellectual property ecosystem in the US, the federal and state laws and regulations that support technology commercialization and underpin the innovation ecosystem. And then finally, we will look at some university-specific policies that address some of the issues that have been raised. So the founding fathers of the United States realized the value of innovation to the economy, and they set forth within the Constitution the ability for Congress to make laws that are supportive of innovators and allow innovators to profit from their innovation. The US Constitution of 1789, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 8, cites that particular clause in the Constitution that the federal government has used to support the innovation ecosystem with appropriate laws and policies and regulations. As we know, any progressive constitution is only as good as the laws that are enacted to effectuate the same. In the Congress of the United States passed Title 35 of the US Code that set up the US Patent and Trademark Office. This is the office that receives innovations, evaluates the same, and issues patents and also settles disputes related to patents. The patents that we file fall among these three: utility patents, design patents, and plant patents. Most of the patents we do are utility patents. Very few design patents, but also we have about 5 to 10% of plant patents. So the University of Minnesota is also known for producing some of the world's best apples. So we have patents for some of those apples, and also we do trademarks for the same apple products often. And an example is Sweet Tango, that we have a trademark for the same, and this actually drives a lot of the revenue that we get back from the activities of the office. We also protect IP through copyrights, and this is especially true for software because software code is not patentable, but we can copyright for the particular written code. So for us to get a patent, you have the 5 primary requirements for patentability. It has to be patentable subject matter. You cannot patent, for example, a surgical method. It has to be useful. There has to be some utility. It has to be new or novel and non-obvious, such that it can't be a product that is generated by the combination of ideas that are already out there in the public. And also it has to be enabled, just plain idea, not patentable. There has to be the application, in this case, example of a utility patent, if that claim that we put in the patent, you have to be able to practice whatever you claim in the patent. So enablement means, we need some evidence that your invention does what you claim it does. The question of Bayh-Dole, quite relevant, because prior to 1980, the federal government funded research as it does now, but very little of that research was commercialized. The Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which was written by Evan Bayh and Bob Dole, two senators from Indiana and Kansas, allowed the recipients of federal money to commercialize the product of that research. And by so doing, they encouraged cooperation between the private and public sector. So we can now take money from the federal government, do our research with a non-profit research organization such as the university. We then elect to take title or ownership of that particular asset, and we commercialize that, and the revenue we get from that commercialization remains with us. In the case of federal government, it doesn't flow back to the federal government, but we have to report that particular invention and what we did with it. There are reporting requirements involved in the Bayh-Dole Act, and this is one of several other acts that enhance the innovation ecosystem. At the same time, this act is what set up the tech transfer professional, which I'm one of those professionals, because prior to 1980, it was a hit and miss activity. Some universities did it, some did not, most did not. But the act standardized this and requires that the universities that get federal money have to have some tech transfer function to report what you did with the money vis-a-vis commercialization once you elect title. The impact of that law was quite obvious. With 14 years preceding the passing of Bayh-Dole, universities got slightly above 4,000 utility patents awarded to them. These were about 500 patents a year. But after the law passed, universities got significantly more utility patents, almost 18,000 patents. So there was a significant change in the mentality vis-a-vis commercialization of innovation. At the same time, the licensing revenue from the issued patents and also the patents being prosecuted, because we can license even before the patent is issued, that revenue continues growing over time. So there was quite a change after the passing of Bayh-Dole. The businesses are regulated by the states, and every state has its own take on how to do business. The state of Minnesota itself has the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and this department gets a substantial amount of funding from state allocation, about $68 million a year, to help startups and just companies in general grow and employ Minnesotans. Several programs are available, which our startups take significant advantage of. So the business financing program, for example, has the Launch Minnesota program that our startups can apply funds to and use that fund to pay for the intellectual property they license from us. And one unique fund is one that helps companies with childcare expenses. You can imagine a startup that has been started by a single parent. That parent wants to grow the startup. However, they have challenges in terms of childcare. One of these grants goes to applicants with such challenges, and the money can be used to support the children as the parent grows the corporate or the company. So that is a unique fund that we have. And of course, the state is nurturing the innovation aspect of this by keeping companies in Minnesota and attracting other companies that may not have such programs within their states. The Minnesota state also provides training grants. Some of the startups that we found require employees with a particular set of skills. So the state provides some money to train employees in certain skills and make them employable, both to our startups and also to the other companies that are located within the state. On the taxation side of this, the state provides some tax credits and tax incentives, and relevant to our startups, the annual tax credit is critical because it allows high net worth individuals to invest in our startups, and they can then take those tax credits and lower their tax burden for a particular year. So that's a very popular credit, as well as the state can designate certain regions or industries to benefit from tax credits. For example, companies developing pediatric medical devices can benefit from these credits to incentivize companies to enter that space, usually because it doesn't have a big enough market to attract a lot of players. At the same time, the business finance guidance is a support program for startups as well as any other company. You can imagine that a 20-year-old has started a company. They don't know how to navigate the business environment, the taxation laws. This fund and program helps such companies navigate the process of financing, taxation, loans, etc., to make sure that they have a strong foundation and they're set up to succeed. And this package of programs helps our startups and just other startups that are founded by people in Minnesota. The state also focuses on regions outside the Twin Cities. Minnesota is a rural state, and to spread economic activity, some of these grants encourage startups to be founded outside the major metropolitan areas. The regulation of business, as I mentioned, is a preserve of the state and not the federal government. The Uniform Commercial Code is a set of comprehensive laws governing how business is conducted, and each state inculcates this code into its state laws. And these laws allow for the smooth running of business, interstate business. Of particular interest to what we do is the contract law, which based on common law, we use this quite often when we transfer our technologies from the university to industry. We do that using contracts, the licensing agreements. We also have inter-institutional agreements that allow us to cooperate with other universities in Minnesota or outside Minnesota. We have material transfer agreements, non-disclosure agreements. So we use contract law extensively in our daily activities. When we license a technology to a company, we have an offer to the company with certain terms. The corporate or licensee accepts those terms, hopefully after some protracted negotiation. And then for that to be legal, we have a consideration, and this is upfront fees we ask from the licensee, or we can take equity from a startup, because without a consideration, that is not a binding contract. At the same time, we have performance requirements for both the licensor, which is the university, that we will not litigate against the company for infringing on our patent, and the company, on the other hand, commits to developing a product within a certain time period. We don't want to license and then a company just sits on our asset and doesn't commercialize it, because then we don't have a return. So we have performances for both parties. And these are done through contract law. To the point of sharing revenue, the commercialization of the intellectual property rights is a policy within the Board of Regents policy that governs the University of Minnesota and our activities. And this policy defines who an inventor is: an employee of the University of Minnesota system who uses significant resources that are granted to university, usually research grants. If they invent something, they are the inventors, but they, through a contract, an assignment document, they yield their ownership rights to that invention to the university, and the university then commercializes that particular innovation. In exchange for that commercialization, we share the revenue, as someone asked a question earlier, and a third of that revenue goes to the inventors, a third goes to the college and department, and a third goes to the office of the vice president for research. So the example of abacavir that we had in the first case study, about $200 million went to the inventors, 200 million went to the department, and about 200 million went to the vice president for research. And this is over a 20-year life of that patent. Another policy that I don't list here that is also important to encouraging entrepreneurships and startup is the entrepreneurship leave. This is where faculty members or staff can take leave from their current position, go to a startup and help found a startup, maybe even establish it, and be able to come back to campus with at the same position that they left. That position is held for them for the duration of the entrepreneurship leave. This is a tightly regulated policy that allows a certain amount of time to be spent doing that entrepreneur activity, and then you can come back. If you feel like you are settled in the company, you can also leave. So that is an open policy in that regard in terms of entrepreneurship, and it is advantageous to faculty members who really want to be deeply engaged in a particular startup. At the same time, we work closely with the Office of the General Counsel. This is the main legal office for the university. The Transactional Law Group works with our office quite intimately. When we write those contracts, they will review them, make sure that all the legal parameters have been met, T's are crossed, I's are dotted, and it's a solid legal document. They also do provide business advice, as the case may be. When we take equity from the startups, they look at the shareholder table and give us advice regarding certain business transactions. This is the same office that litigates. If someone infringes on our patent, the General Counsel's office will take enforcement measures against that entity. And often if we win, then we get some damages, but the Office of General Counsel does all the legal work related to the transactions that we conduct as an office. Finally, we will look at the funding of the innovation enterprise. So the federal government, through the Bayh-Dole Act, is quite lenient in terms of allowing us to take ownership of inventions and innovations generated by federal taxpayer money. And you have over 26 government agencies. It's a forest of activity and a beehive of opportunity. It can be difficult for an individual faculty member to navigate, but suffice it to say there is a lot of opportunity for funding. And just before I came to this presentation, I checked and saw that the National Institute of Health sometimes funds research outside the US, and a few people in Kenya have grants from the National Institute of Health, for example. So some of these granting mechanisms are agnostic to citizenship. They will fund anyone anywhere in the world so long as you meet with the specific requirements for that funding agency. The main funding work that we get is from the NIH, as I mentioned. We also get from the National Science Foundation, NSF, that does a lot of the engineering, technology, and math field, as well as the Small Business Administration, where they offer startup money and small grant money for some of our startups. Looking at the share of money that goes to the different kinds of research, basic research, translational research, and productization, you can see the funders varies. Basic research is funded principally by the federal government. As you can see, 42% of that research is funded by the federal government, about 30% by businesses, then universities and nonprofits. And this is because This is where all the inventions come from, something new, useful, but may not necessarily have commercial value. When you transition to more translational research, where you are looking at innovations, things with commercial potential, of course, businesses are in the commercial field, so most of this work is funded by businesses. Up to over half of it is funded by businesses, then the government, then a little bit by the universities. When you go to productization research, this is when you are looking at scale up, clinical trials, things that are focused more on the production of a product or a service. This kind of research is principally funded by corporates or businesses, 85% of it. And universities are not in this space, so very little of that is funded by universities. So this shows that we as a University Tech Transfer Office really have to work intimately with corporates to be able to move our innovations to the marketplace. And the corporates are the ones that launch the products. We transfer the asset to them. In terms of startup support, we have both the private sector and the public sector. The public sector, especially our startups, have some advantage because they have access to translational funding. For example, we can de-risk the technology before we give it to our startup or license it to our startup. The federal government also has the Small Business Administration funds, and these are also distributed by the 26 agencies. Each of them have a business development SBIR grant that startups can apply for. The I6 challenge is a granting mechanisms for companies and startups that are outside the major regions, the major technology regions of the East Coast, West Coast, and the Chicago area. This is for the federal government's interest in spreading commercial opportunity. So everybody has a potential of getting these funds as long as you're in certain regions, it's regional. And this money, again, is accessible to the startups to de-risk their technology and establish themselves. The seed fund support is a similar mechanism funded by the federal government. At the state level, we have accelerators and incubators. And indeed, once we take our startups from the university environment, it often goes either to an accelerator or an incubator locally within the state, where they can advance the technology through research and development. However, startups that are not connected to the universities have unique challenges because they have to look for funds. There is a pool of funds for the federal government available to them as well, such as the SBIR grants. But if they have to de-risk a technology, they have to look for private funding. Family and friends can provide some of those funding, but if you don't have high net worth individuals in your lineage, that can be a challenge. Private seed funding also is accessible, as well as angel funding and venture capital. However, the private funding portion of it, you have to give up equity in the startup to be able to access these funds. However, the government portion, those are often non-dilutive funds. So we don't take equity, or the government does not take equity once it provides that startup funding. So that's a major discrimination among the startups that are private, started by private individuals with no connection to the university. And that's why the university innovation ecosystem has a stronger capacity, or the startups that are started at universities have a better chance of success as opposed to others that already have to give up equity to get money to get started. The private industry continues to be the primary source of funds for startups. And this slide shows here, most startups get their funding from venture capital in exchange for equity. Friends and family can give you the initial non-dilutive funds if you are a startup. And the interesting thing here is that venture capital investments have not declined even with the pandemic. As you can see, in 2020, you have about $130 billion in venture capital investments going into startups at various stages of development. That's quite interesting. But then again, the stock market has done relatively well in the 2020 pandemic year. So venture capital still remains the primary source of funding opportunities for startups. Both universities started and started by the general public. So the legal framework that allows for a robust innovation ecosystem is supported by 3 pillars: business, law, and science. In terms of business, you want a policy and legal framework that allows for smooth registration of a startup with very low startup cost and registration costs, an enabling business environment with appropriate tax credits where necessary and support programs and mechanisms, and also business conflict resolution mechanisms that are fast and effective. The law portion, you need robust contract law and contract law enforcement that allows us to license and be sure that nobody will infringe on our patents, for example, allows us to enforce the contract as well. So a solid legal foundation that is amenable to startups is also essential. The foundation of everything we do is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM, or even we also include arts in there because not everybody is interested in STEM, so arts as well. So an education system that supports an entrepreneurship, innovative mentality all the way from K through 12, that's elementary through high school and into college, is also essential in making sure that this ecosystem works as intended. So to bring everything together, in conclusion, we see that innovation and academic-centered innovation, in our particular case, does have benefits, economic and health benefits to the society. And the return on investment that we get from, it's a long-term investment, is shared with the universities as well as inventors at different ratios, depending on the institution. And a robust institutional framework is necessary to anchor innovation and commercialization in terms of helping the economy grow. And the US, at least up to now, has been quite successful in this, and we have exported such. The Bayh-Dole Act, for example, since 1980 has been replicated in 16 other countries, including South Africa. So that's something that we have exported. And as we conclude here and get into taking some of your questions, I wanted us to have this as a food for thought. This is a patent that has been issued for a method of exercising a cat. Someone got this patent because indeed it is an invention. It is a creation of something new. Exercising a cat using a laser beam was new, at least when that patent was issued. It was useful to the cat. The cat can exercise. Maybe also useful to the owner of the cat. They are happy that their cat is exercising. But is this an innovation, and can it be commercialized? So as you marinate on that, as we wind up after the question studies, that's just food for thought. So we have to screen our inventions, whether they're innovations and whether they are actually indeed commercializable. Do we want to expend money to commercialize a laser beam exercising of a cat? And with that, we will take some additional questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Dr. Karanja. I think just reading from the comments and so on and so forth, it gets a sense that this has been valuable and insightful to people who are interested in developing ideas. And I also like the way you've concluded in trying to distinguish between inventions and innovation and therefore commercialization. So this is one of the tracks that Kenya is laying a strong foundation to try and support. I would mention that we've actually started looking at the legal framework. And as you mentioned, the legal framework in the US and even how you've succeeded to other countries. One of them that we want to list is Kenya in a few years' time. We've got a committee which has even legal experts in it. By mid of this month of April, we are reviewing a policy analysis to assess where our gaps. And we hope that we will use that as a foundation to build a localized, legal framework. Now, I've got a couple of questions, and I honestly can't read all of them because there are many. Let's look at questions around the institutional relationship with the innovators or inventors. One question is, what criteria is used to decide whether an invention or an idea qualifies for a patent or trademark or copyright? That's one. In other words, what's really the criteria here? The second is, are patents issued to the university or to the owner of the invention or innovation? And as a follow-up to that, can the creator refuse to relinquish ownership of an invention to the institution, or is it something mandatory? Why don't we go with those three and then come back to another set?
All right. So the criteria for patenting, trademark, or copyright depends on the type of innovation or invention, because it's inventions that we file for patents. However, we only file for the ones that have commercial potential. So we have to make that analysis, and we do that by interviewing the technology strategy group I mentioned during part one. We'll interview the inventor, the university, to understand how did this invention come about? Were you just looking at a basic biology or physics mechanism? And then we have to make that judgment as to, can this be an actual innovation? So we also do some high-level economic analysis to look at the market and what is being addressed by this invention. And if we can ascertain that there is some value, then we will pick the appropriate intellectual property mechanism or pathway, whether it's a patent or a copyright. Trademarks are unique because those are marks and pictures and labels, so we don't do a lot of those. But in terms of determining what we file for, we look for commercial potential because we want to be able to recoup the cost of prosecuting that patent. The issue of inventor, that's a good one. That's a good one. Is actually a question of law, right? The university has ownership to the commercial rights and other rights of that invention. So what we do is, when an inventor declares an invention, we ask them to assign those rights to the university. And there is a debate whether we should make that automatic. Some institutions in the US, once you are employed, you assign your rights to any inventions as a condition of your employment. Others will do it by asking you to sign off your rights to the invention. If you refuse, then you might be fired. Nobody has ever been fired, but we haven't found someone who refuses to assign those rights to the university. But yes, we can do it either by automatic when you are hired, or by asking you to assign when you declare the invention. So the last question, I think I forgot the last question about the inventor.
It's around whether an innovator can choose and refuse to relinquish ownership of the invention to the institution.
Theoretically, they can, but often they do not. They always assign their rights to the university.
Yeah, I think part of this also has to do with what this support system the university has. You see, sometimes we ask this question because there is an inherent feeling that I own these, and probably the institution might not support me as much to move this to greater value. But I think what I'm reading more and more in your context, and it's part of what we have to try and build, is whereby the institution supports the innovator or the inventor using the internal systems to move this solution to a greater level that
yes.
could not happen if the individual tries to do it alone. So
Correct.
It means you're better off actually surrendering what you must surrender.
Right.
I have seen some hands up, but I've been hesitant to pick hands because it's just a little bit a question of connectivity sometimes and so forth. So what I would like to do is to take 3 more questions and we're going to close. We've kind of like gone beyond what we had planned. We thought it would do in 1.5 hours, but the debate has been long, the interesting conversations. So I'm sorry, we may not be able to take all the questions, but let's see what we can do in this final round. There's a question around any laws or policies that permit university staff to work on spin-off companies or startups. I think that one is kind of already answered by the laws system in the US, and we're beginning to build this kind of systems around. That's part of why Kenya was established to work with other agencies. There was a question around how long it takes to have an innovation through a whole process. I guess as you answered, it is case by case, depends on the complexity of the domain and the support systems that are needed. There is a question around if an institution fails to recognize an invention as a potential for commercialization, can the innovator or inventor individually decide to seek personal means for funding it forward to a point of commercialization? That would be an interesting to think about. I think over to you.
Right, so that one, yes, we do. So we do assign the rights back to the inventor in the case where we determine that there is no commercial value and we don't want to pay for the patent. We will assign that back. But we also, it's very stringent, it's very narrow, it's only an assignment for that particular piece of invention or innovation. Nothing more, nothing that they do next year. That is a new thing that they have to disclose to us. But yes, there is that mechanism. And we ask them also to warrant, it's a legal document. So we ask them to state that they don't have a backup plan, that they haven't been talking to corporates behind our back and they are going to just flip it to someone, that if they know someone wants it, they have to tell us before we assign it to them. And then we can vet whether it's something we want to keep or not. But yes, that option is there.
Okay, so I have the last one from a student. It's called Geoffrey Ochim. I thought let's give it to a student. How can you help to nurture student innovation in university setting so that they can focus on commercialization, because they feel that ideas are dying at the presentation stage, either due to lack of support or funding or structures and so on and so forth. Yes, the fact that there's lack of some infrastructure or support, that simply means if we build some of this infrastructure support, then we increase the likelihood of success. But maybe what would be your parting shot in motivating students to think innovation, invention, commercialization?
Right, the mindset, yes. So problem solving is key. So a lot of the approach, we call it in the biomedical space, the Stanford biodesign, where you are looking at a problem that people are having and innovating to solve that problem is instead of just innovating for innovation's sake. So that design-focused mindset that Dr. Muanza, you mentioned earlier as well, looking at how do you solve a problem using the skills and expertise that you have. In terms of university support, working with the business school, most schools have a business school, and plugging into that ecosystem to understand how problems, once you solve a problem, how then you can scale up that solution to become a product for the general consumer market. So just understanding problem solving and using what you have to solve that particular problem.
Great, thanks very much. I think we just have to come close to an end now. It's late in the day in Kenya, and I think in the US, it's some weird hour there. We need to transition. So I wish I could take all the questions because there are still more, but I think we just have to end there. First of all, keep in mind that this presentation was streamed on YouTube. So we will put it on the YouTube channel of Kenya National Innovation Agency, Kenya. You're welcome. Check it out, Kenya Online. And the presentation, I believe Dr. Karanja would be more than happy to share the slides. I don't think there is anything that is too sensitive there. No. And in a special manner, I would like to thank you, Ken, for creating time. And I can see the patriotism in you to see how you can share your insights and experiences. And we do have your contact, and I'm sure some people are already asking for contacts.
Absolutely.
We'll how to share some of those contacts with them. And I want to appreciate the participant. By the way, we went all the way to 160 or thereabout, which means there was quite some demand. And the representation is across the country. I saw people from Kakamega, from Kisumu, from Mombasa and Nairobi, and so on and so forth. To the participants, be on the lookout. There will be other webinars that we are creating, we are organizing. Probably we might do one or so per month. And they should be as insightful as this one. And of course, we will vary different topics so that we energize the ecosystem and inspire people to make their individual contribution towards a better society. Thank you very much, and have a good evening or good morning, depending on where you are.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for having me.